Have you ever been in a room full of people wearing designer labels and dripping in diamonds, feeling their eyes scan you from head to toe, silently calculating your worth based on the price tag of your outfit? Have you ever felt that crushing weight of judgment, that suffocating sensation, when you know people are whispering about you, laughing at you, dismissing you as somehow less than them because of what you're wearing? Well, let me tell you what happened to me at the Grandview Charity Gala last spring, and how one moment of humiliation turned into the most empowering experience of my life. My name is Sarah, and this is the true story of how I smiled through their mockery until I pulled out something that changed everything. I still remember every single detail of that evening, the way my heart was pounding as I walked through those massive oak doors, the sound of string quartets filling the marble-floored ballroom, the glittering chandeliers that seemed to mock my simple presence with their ostentatious display of wealth. I had chosen to wear a modest navy blue dress that I'd purchased from a local department store. Nothing fancy, nothing that would turn heads, just a simple, elegant piece that made me feel comfortable and true to myself. My shoes were practical flats. My jewelry was minimal, just a small silver necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, and I carried a plain black clutch that had served me well for years. I knew I looked different from everyone else there, but I had made a conscious choice about how I wanted to present myself to the world, and I was determined to stand by that choice no matter what anyone thought. As I entered that glittering ballroom, I could feel the stares, the not-so-subtle glances, the way conversations seemed to pause as I walked by. And I knew exactly what they were thinking because I could read it in their eyes, in the slight upturn of their perfectly painted lips, in the way they leaned toward each other to whisper behind manicured hands. The Charity Gala was one of the most prestigious events in our city, attended by the who's who of high society, business moguls, socialites, celebrities, and politicians, all gathered under the guise of supporting a worthy cause. Though if I'm being honest, it often felt more like a competition to see who could wear the most expensive gown or the most outrageous piece of jewelry. I had attended these events before, many times actually, but this particular evening felt different. There was a tension in the air, an undercurrent of judgment that seemed more pronounced than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something that would change me forever. I made my way to the bar, hoping a glass of champagne might calm my nerves, and that's when I heard it. The first comment, delivered in a voice just loud enough for me to hear, dripping with condescension and barely concealed contempt. "Oh my God, did you see what she's wearing?" a woman's voice said, and I didn't need to turn around to know she was talking about me. I could feel it in my bones, that sickening certainty that you're the subject of someone's ridicule. I mean, I know it's a charity event, but that doesn't mean you should dress like you're the charity case. Another voice chimed in, followed by a chorus of laughter that felt like knives piercing my chest. I forced myself to smile, to keep my composure, to breathe through the humiliation that was washing over me in waves. But inside, I was crumbling, feeling every insecurity I'd ever had about myself bubbling to the surface, threatening to overwhelm me completely. I took my champagne and turned to face the room. And that's when I locked eyes with Victoria Ashford, the queen bee of our city's social circle. A woman whose wealth was only surpassed by her cruelty, standing there in a gown that probably cost more than most people's annual salary, surrounded by her loyal followers who hung on her every word like disciples at the feet of a prophet. She looked at me with such undisguised disdain that it took my breath away, her eyes traveling slowly from my face down to my shoes and back up again. A journey of judgment that left me feeling completely exposed and vulnerable. "Sarah, darling," she said, her voice sweet as poison. I didn't realize the dress code had changed to thrift store chic. The women around her erupted in laughter, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger. But I maintained my smile, that mask I'd perfected over the years, the one that hid all the pain and hurt and frustration I was feeling deep inside. "I see you're really embracing the whole humble approach tonight," she continued, clearly enjoying the attention she was getting from her cruel commentary. "Though I must say there's a difference between humble and, well, whatever this is." She gestured vaguely at my outfit, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, the pleasure she derived from making me feel small, from asserting her dominance in this carefully constructed social hierarchy where appearance was everything and authenticity was seen as weakness. What Victoria and her friends didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that I had made a very deliberate choice about how I lived my life, and it had nothing to do with what I could or couldn't afford. Have you ever reached a point in your life where you questioned everything you thought you knew about success, happiness, and what really matters? That's where I had been 3 years ago, standing at a crossroads, forced to confront some hard truths about myself and the world I'd been living in. I grew up in a world not unlike the one I was standing in that night, a world of privilege and excess where your worth was measured by your possessions and your connections, where the right last name could open any door and the wrong outfit could close them all. My father was a successful real estate developer, and my mother came from old money, the kind that stretched back generations and came with expectations that weighed heavier than any piece of jewelry. I had everything I could possibly want. A closet full of designer clothes that I barely wore, a collection of handbags that could have funded a small country, jewelry that spent more time in a safe than on my body, and access to a lifestyle that most people only saw in magazines or movies. I attended the finest schools, traveled to exotic locations, dined at restaurants where a single meal cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month, and I never questioned any of it because it was all I knew, it was the water I swam in, and you don't question water when you've never known anything else. But then something happened that shattered my comfortable existence and forced me to see the world, and myself, in a completely different light. My younger sister, Emily, had always been different from the rest of our family. More compassionate, more aware of the suffering in the world, more troubled by the inequality she saw all around us. While I was shopping for my next designer handbag, she was volunteering at homeless shelters. While I was planning my next vacation to some exclusive resort, she was organizing fundraisers for families who couldn't afford basic necessities. And while I was completely absorbed in my superficial world of appearances and status, she was living a life of genuine purpose and meaning. I used to think she was naive, that she didn't understand how the world really worked, that she would eventually grow out of this phase and join the rest of us in our pursuit of material success and social climbing. But then Emily got sick, terrifyingly sick, and suddenly all the money in the world, all the connections, all the privilege, couldn't save her from the brutal reality of a rare and aggressive form of cancer. I watched my vibrant, compassionate, beautiful sister transform before my eyes, her body weakening under the assault of chemotherapy, her spirit tested by pain and fear, and the knowledge that her time might be running out. And through it all, she maintained a grace and wisdom that put the rest of us to shame. I remember sitting by her hospital bed one night, both of us unable to sleep, and she took my hand in hers, those thin fingers that used to be so strong, and she said something that would change my life forever. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice weak, but her eyes burning with an intensity that made me lean closer. "I've been thinking about what really matters. And you know what I've realized? All the stuff we thought was so important, the clothes, the parties, the status, none of it means anything. Absolutely nothing." She paused to catch her breath, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. Not tears of self-pity, but tears of frustration that she had wasted so much time on things that didn't matter. The only things that are real are the connections we make with people, the kindness we show, the difference we make in someone's life, and the authenticity with which we live our own lives, she continued, and I felt something crack open inside me, some protective shell I'd built around my heart, and suddenly I was crying too, sobbing actually, because I knew she was right, and I knew I'd been living a lie, chasing things that could never fulfill me, never make me truly happy. Emily survived her cancer, thank God, and her recovery was long and difficult, but she emerged from that experience with an even stronger commitment to living authentically and making a difference in the world. And I emerged from it transformed, questioning everything about the life I'd been living, unable to continue pretending that any of it mattered. I started slowly at first, pulling back from the social scene, spending less on frivolous things, investing more time in volunteer work and meaningful relationships, and the more I changed, the more I realized how much of my previous life had been performance, a carefully constructed facade designed to win approval from people whose opinions I no longer valued. I began donating most of my designer wardrobe to organizations that helped women re-entering the workforce, keeping only a few pieces for occasions when I absolutely needed them, and I discovered that wearing simple, modest clothing actually made me feel more like myself, more authentic, more free from the pressure to constantly impress and compete. I redirected the money I would have spent on expensive clothes and accessories toward causes that mattered, scholarships for underprivileged students, support for families facing medical crises, funding for community programs that actually made a difference in people's lives, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was living with purpose, like my existence meant something beyond just consuming and displaying wealth. My parents were horrified by my transformation, concerned that I was throwing away my social standing and my future, that I would regret this decision when I wanted to marry well or maintain the lifestyle I'd grown up with. But I tried to explain to them that I didn't want that lifestyle anymore, that it had never made me happy, that I'd just been going through the motions because I didn't know there was another way to live. Some of my old friends drifted away, uncomfortable with my new priorities and values, while others revealed themselves to be true friends who respected my choices even if they didn't fully understand them. And through it all, I felt lighter, more alive, more connected to what was real and true and meaningful in life. But I also knew that there would be moments like this one, standing in a ballroom full of people who judged me based on my appearance, who couldn't see past the surface to the person I really was. And I had to decide how I would handle those moments, whether I would let their judgment affect me or whether I would stand firm in my values and my choices. As I stood there that night listening to Victoria's mocking comments and her friends' cruel laughter, I made a decision that would define not just that evening but my entire approach to living authentically in a world that values appearance over substance. The mockery didn't stop with Victoria's initial comments. In fact, it seemed to embolden others in the room who saw an opportunity to elevate themselves by putting me down, and I watched as the cruelty spread like a contagion through the ballroom. A woman I'd known since childhood, Margaret Preston, who had always been competitive and insecure, sidled up to Victoria's group and added her own commentary. "I heard Sarah's been going through some kind of midlife crisis," she said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Next thing you know, she'll be joining a commune or something." More laughter, more stares, more whispers behind hands and fans, and I could feel my resolve being tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had thought I was strong enough to withstand their judgment, that I'd worked through my need for their approval. But standing there as the target of their collective ridicule, I felt old insecurities creeping back in. That voice in my head asking if maybe they were right, maybe I'd made a mistake, maybe I should have just conformed and avoided all this pain and humiliation. I excused myself to the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect myself, to remember why I'd made the choices I'd made, to reconnect with the strength I knew I had inside me. I looked at myself in the mirror, at my simple dress and minimal makeup, and I saw not someone who was less than the women out there in their designer gowns, but someone who had chosen a different path, someone who valued substance over style, authenticity over appearance, meaning over materialism. I took several deep breaths, squared my shoulders, and walked back out into that ballroom with renewed determination. But Victoria wasn't finished with me yet, not by a long shot. She had gathered a larger audience now, and she was clearly enjoying her role as the evening's entertainment at my expense. "You know what I think?" she announced as I approached, her voice carrying across the room with practiced projection. "I think Sarah is trying to make some kind of statement, like she's better than the rest of us because she's dressing like a pauper." She looked at me with false concern, her head tilted in that way that was supposed to convey sympathy but only conveyed condescension. "It's actually quite sad, this need to be different, to reject the beautiful things in life. I mean, what are you trying to prove, Sarah?" The question hung in the air, and I could feel everyone waiting for my response, eager to see if I would defend myself, break down, or simply walk away in defeat. I opened my mouth to respond, to try to explain that this wasn't about proving anything or being better than anyone. It was simply about living according to my values. But before I could speak, Victoria's friend Jacqueline interrupted with another jab. "Maybe she can't afford nice clothes anymore," Jacqueline suggested with mock concern. "I heard her father's business has been struggling. Maybe they've fallen on hard times and she's too proud to admit it." The insinuation was offensive on multiple levels, not just because it was completely untrue, but because it revealed their assumption that the only reason someone would dress modestly was poverty, that given the means, everyone would naturally choose expensive designer labels and ostentatious displays of wealth. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and righteous, mixing with the hurt and humiliation to create a volatile emotional cocktail that threatened to spill over. Have you ever been pushed to your absolute limit, where every instinct is screaming at you to lash out, to defend yourself, to put your tormentors in their place? That's where I was in that moment, teetering on the edge of losing my composure completely. But then something shifted inside me, a clarity that cut through all the noise and emotion, and I realized that this moment was actually a gift, an opportunity to show these people what real strength looked like, what authentic confidence meant, and what happened when you lived your values even in the face of ridicule and judgment. I had been carrying something in my clutch all evening, something I'd brought almost as a talisman, a reminder of why I'd made the changes I'd made in my life, and suddenly I knew that the time had come to share it, to reveal the truth that would transform this entire situation. "You want to know the truth?" I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, and the room fell silent, everyone leaning in to hear what I would say. expecting perhaps a confession of financial ruin or a defensive explanation about my choices. The truth is that I could afford any dress in this room. I could outspend every single one of you if I wanted to, but I've chosen not to because I've learned something that apparently none of you have figured out yet. I saw Victoria's face change, confusion mixing with irritation that I wasn't playing the role she'd assigned me, the role of the humiliated victim who would slink away in shame, and I felt a surge of power, the power that comes from knowing your truth and being willing to speak it regardless of the consequences. 3 years ago, my sister almost died from cancer, I continued, and I saw some faces soften at this revelation, though Victoria's remained hard and skeptical. And watching her fight for her life, seeing what really matters when you're facing mortality, it changed me fundamentally and irreversibly. I paused, looking around the room at all these people in their expensive clothes and jewelry, people I'd once been just like, people I'd once desperately wanted to impress, and I felt nothing but compassion for them because I knew they were trapped in the same prison I'd escaped from. I realized that I'd been spending obscene amounts of money on things that didn't matter, that I'd been participating in this game where we all try to outdo each other with our displays of wealth. And for what? To feel superior? To prove we're successful? To fill some void inside us that no amount of designer labels could ever fill? I saw some people shifting uncomfortably now, perhaps recognizing themselves in my words, perhaps feeling the sting of truth that cut too close to their own insecurities and choices. So I made a decision to live differently, to redirect my resources toward things that actually make a difference in the world, toward helping people who are struggling, toward supporting causes that matter. And yes, that meant changing how I dress, how I spend my money, how I spend my time. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically, clearly unimpressed by what she saw as a self-righteous lecture. And she opened her mouth to deliver what I'm sure would have been another cutting remark. But I wasn't finished, not even close. "You mocked my cheap clothes," I said, reaching into my clutch and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "But let me show you what I did with the money I didn't spend on an expensive gown for tonight." The paper I held was a bank statement, and as I unfolded it, I could see curiosity replacing some of the hostility in the faces around me, people wondering what I was about to reveal, what possible proof I could offer that would justify my choices or vindicate my position. "This dress cost me $75, I said, gesturing to my simple navy outfit. "And you're right. Compared to what most of you are wearing, it's incredibly cheap, laughably cheap even by the standards of this crowd." I saw Victoria smirk, clearly thinking I was about to prove her point about my poor fashion choices, but I continued before she could interrupt. "But here's what I want you to understand," I said, my voice growing stronger as I prepared to share what I'd been building up to all evening. "The designer gown I would have worn to this event, the one that would have met your approval and saved me from your mockery, would have cost approximately $15,000, maybe more if I'd really wanted to make an impression." I heard gasps around the room, though whether they were gasps of shock at the price or gasps of recognition from people who'd spent similar amounts on their own gowns, I couldn't tell. Instead of spending $15,000 on a dress I'd wear once and then let hang in my closet gathering dust, I took that money and I made a different choice. I held up the bank statement so everyone could see it, though I knew they couldn't read the details from where they stood. I donated $14,925 to the Riverside Children's Hospital, specifically to their fund for families who can't afford the medical care their children need. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and charged. And I could see people's faces changing, the mockery draining away to be replaced by confusion, surprise, and in some cases, shame. "That money is paying for chemotherapy treatments for a 7-year-old girl named Emma who has the same kind of cancer my sister had," I continued, my voice breaking slightly as I thought about little Emma and her brave fight. "It's covering the cost of surgery for a teenage boy who needs a heart transplant, and it's helping 3 other families who were facing bankruptcy because of medical bills they had no way to pay." I looked directly at Victoria, who for once in her life seemed speechless, her perfectly made-up face frozen in an expression of shock. "So yes, Victoria, I'm wearing cheap clothes, and I'm going to continue wearing cheap clothes, and I'm going to continue redirecting my money toward causes that actually matter, toward people who actually need help, toward making a real difference in the world instead of just playing dress-up to impress people whose opinions I no longer value." The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy, and I could see people looking at each other, looking at their own expensive outfits, perhaps for the first time questioning the choices they'd made. But I wasn't done yet, because there was more to this story, more that needed to be said. "And you know what the really interesting part is?" I said, pulling out another piece of paper from my clutch. "This charity gala we're all attending tonight, this event that's supposed to be about raising money for worthy causes, Do you know how much money it actually raises versus how much it costs to put on? I saw the event organizers shifting nervously, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going, but I pressed on because the truth needed to be told. Last year, this event cost $375,000 to produce. The venue, the catering, the entertainment, the decorations, all of it. And it raised $450,000 for charity, which means the net benefit was $75,000. I let that sink in for a moment, watching comprehension dawn on faces around the room. $75,000, that's wonderful, that's going to help people. But think about this for a moment. If everyone in this room had simply donated the amount they spent on their outfits for tonight, on their gowns and tuxedos and jewelry and shoes and handbags, we could have raised well over $1 million, maybe closer to $2 million. And all of that money could have gone directly to help people instead of being filtered through an expensive event that's more about seeing and being seen than about actually making a difference. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The mockery and judgment replaced by an uncomfortable awareness, a collective realization that they'd been participating in something that was more about ego and appearance than about genuine charity and compassion. I saw several women looking down at their gowns with new eyes, perhaps calculating for the first time what that money could have done if directed differently. "I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad," I said, softening my tone because I genuinely wasn't trying to shame them. I was trying to wake them up, to help them see what I'd seen. "I'm just trying to explain why I made the choices I made, why I choose to live differently now, and why your mockery, while painful, doesn't change my commitment to living according to my values." I looked at Victoria again, and I saw something I'd never seen before in her perfectly composed face, a crack in the facade, a flicker of something that might have been uncertainty, or even respect. "The truth is, Victoria, you're right that I'm trying to make a statement but not the one you think," I continued, speaking directly to her now. "I'm not trying to be better than you or anyone else. I'm not judging you for your choices. I'm simply showing that there's another way to live, a way that values substance over style, impact over image, authenticity over appearance." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the entire room's attention on me, feeling the significance of this moment and how it might change not just my relationships with these people, but potentially how they saw themselves and their own choices. When my sister was sick, lying in that hospital bed, do you know what she said to me? I asked, my voice cracking with emotion as I remembered that conversation. She said that she wished she'd spent less time worrying about what people thought of her, and more time being true to herself. She wished she'd spent less money on things and more on experiences and helping others. She wished she'd had the courage to live authentically instead of performing for an audience that didn't really care about her anyway. I saw tears in a few eyes now, perhaps people thinking about their own mortality, their own regrets, their own unexpressed authentic selves. And I promised her that night that if she survived, if she made it through this nightmare, I would live differently. I would be braver, more authentic, more committed to what really matters. And that's what I've been doing for the past 3 years. I held up the bank statement again. "So when you mock my cheap clothes, what you're really mocking is my choice to prioritize helping a dying child over impressing you, and I have to tell you, that's a choice I'm proud of, a choice I'll make every single day for the rest of my life, regardless of what anyone thinks about it." The room remained silent, and I could see people processing what I'd said, some with shame, some with admiration, some with a mixture of both. But there was one more thing I needed to share, one more piece of the puzzle that would complete the picture I was painting. "There's something else you should know," I said, my voice steady now, calm and clear. "Something I haven't told many people because I didn't want it to change how I was treated or how people related to me." I paused, making sure I had everyone's attention, especially Victoria's. 2 years ago, I started a foundation, the Emily Hope Foundation, named after my sister, and we've been quietly funding medical treatments for children with cancer and other life-threatening illnesses. We've helped over 200 families so far, covering costs that insurance won't pay, providing housing for families who have to travel for treatment, supporting research into pediatric diseases. I saw shock rippling through the crowd, people clearly having no idea that I'd been involved in this kind of work, and I realized that my commitment to living modestly and avoiding attention had meant that even my charitable work had gone largely unnoticed. "The foundation is funded entirely by money I would have otherwise spent on the lifestyle I used to have," I continued. "Every designer handbag I don't buy, every luxury vacation I don't take, every expensive piece of jewelry I don't purchase, that money goes into the foundation, and it's making a real, tangible difference in people's lives." I pulled out one more paper from my clutch, a photograph, and I held it up so people could see. This is Emma, the little girl whose chemotherapy I'm currently paying for. She's 7 years old. She loves butterflies and painting and stories about princesses, and she's fighting for her life with more courage than any of us in this room could imagine. The photograph showed a beautiful little girl with a bright smile and a bald head, her eyes sparkling with life despite the obvious toll of her treatment. "This is why I wear cheap clothes," I said simply, my voice thick with emotion. "Because every dollar I save is a dollar that could save Emma's life or the life of a child like her, and I will not, prioritize my appearance over their survival." The transformation in the room was complete. The judgment and mockery had evaporated, replaced by something else entirely, something that felt like respect, mixed with shame, mixed with perhaps a dawning awareness that they'd been measuring success and worth by all the wrong standards. Victoria, who had been so cruel and confident just minutes before, now looked small and uncertain, her expensive gown suddenly seeming less like a symbol of success and more like evidence of misplaced priorities. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and I could tell it took enormous effort for her to say those words, to admit she'd been wrong, to acknowledge that her cruelty had been unjustified. "I had no idea. I just thought, I don't know what I thought, but I was wrong to judge you, wrong to mock you, wrong to make assumptions about your choices without understanding them." I saw genuine remorse in her eyes, and I felt my anger melting away, replaced by compassion for this woman who was so trapped in her need for status and approval that she couldn't see beyond the surface of things. "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. "I understand the world we grew up in, the values we were taught, the pressure to compete and compare and constantly prove our worth through external displays of success. I understand it because I lived it for 30 years before I woke up and realized there had to be a better way." Several other women approached me then, some apologizing for their participation in the mockery, others asking questions about the foundation and how they could help. And I felt the energy in the room shifting from hostility to curiosity, to something that felt almost like inspiration. Margaret Preston, who had suggested I was having a midlife crisis, came up to me with tears in her eyes. "I spend thousands of dollars on clothes every month," she confessed. "Thousands of dollars that just sit in my closet with tags still on them, and I never thought about what else I could do with that money. I never questioned whether it was making me happy or just feeding an addiction to shopping and consuming." She looked at me with something like desperation. "How did you break free from it? How did you find the courage to live differently when everyone around you is still caught up in the same cycle?" It was a profound question, one that deserved a thoughtful answer, and I took a moment to really consider it before responding. "It started with questioning everything," I said. "Questioning why I bought what I bought, why I cared what people thought, why I measured my worth by my possessions, and when I really examined those questions honestly, I realized that most of my consumption was driven by fear and insecurity, fear of not being good enough, fear of not fitting in, fear of being judged, and once I saw that pattern, once I understood it, I could make different choices." The conversation expanded as more people joined our circle. Genuine conversations about values and meaning and purpose, about the emptiness that often lurks beneath the surface of material success, about the longing for something more authentic and meaningful. Have you ever experienced one of those moments where everything shifts? Where what seemed important suddenly seems trivial, and what seemed trivial suddenly seems essential? That's what was happening in that ballroom, a collective awakening to questions that most of these people had been avoiding for years. The evening took on a completely different tone after my revelation. The superficial small talk and social posturing gave way to deeper, more meaningful conversations, and I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to know more about the foundation, about my sister's recovery, about how I'd made the transition from my old lifestyle to my new one. I shared Emma's story in more detail, how her parents had been facing the impossible choice between bankruptcy and their daughter's life, how the foundation had stepped in to cover the costs that insurance wouldn't pay, how we'd not only funded her treatment but also provided housing so her family could stay together during her hospitalization. I talked about the other children we'd helped, about Marcus who needed a heart transplant, about Sophia whose rare genetic disorder required experimental treatment that insurance deemed not medically necessary, about Jacob whose family had lost everything in a house fire and then learned their son had leukemia. Each story seemed to crack open hearts that had been closed, to remind people of what really matters in life, to inspire them to think differently about their own choices and priorities. Victoria, to her credit, didn't slink away in embarrassment but stayed and listened, asked questions, and at one point she said something that surprised me. "I've been so focused on maintaining my position in society, on being seen as successful and important, that I've forgotten to actually do anything important," she admitted. her usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability I'd never seen in her. I host fundraisers and attend charity events, but it's all for show. It's all about being seen doing good rather than actually doing good, and hearing you talk about Emma and the other children, I realize I've been completely missing the point. She looked at me with genuine curiosity. How much difference could I make if I took just half of what I spend on clothes and jewelry and redirected it towards something meaningful? The question opened up a conversation about practical ways she could get involved, and I could see her mind working. Perhaps for the first time, considering how she could use her resources and influence for genuine good, rather than just social positioning. Several other women expressed similar interest, and by the end of the evening, we had exchanged contact information and made plans to meet again to discuss ways they could support the foundation or start their own charitable initiatives. The event organizers approached me cautiously, perhaps expecting criticism for the expensive production, but I tried to be diplomatic. I'm not saying charity galas are inherently wrong, I explained. I'm just saying we should be honest about what they are. They're social events that happen to raise some money for charity, rather than purely charitable endeavors. And there's nothing wrong with social events, but let's not pretend they're the most efficient way to help people in need. We had a fascinating conversation about how the event could be restructured to maintain its social function, while being more cost-effective and directing more money toward actual charitable work, and I could see them genuinely considering changes for next year's gala. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many stopped to thank me for my honesty and courage, and several slipped me envelopes containing checks for the foundation, donations that totaled more than $50,000 by the time I counted them later that night. But beyond the money, what struck me most was how the energy had shifted, how people seemed lighter somehow, more thoughtful, more aware of possibilities beyond the narrow confines of their usual social concerns. I drove home that night feeling exhausted but also exhilarated, emotionally drained from the confrontation, but also energized by the connections I'd made and the conversations I'd sparked. I thought about how terrifying it had been to stand there being mocked and judged, how every instinct had screamed at me to defend myself or retreat, and how glad I was that I'd found the courage to stay present and share my truth. When I got home, I sat down at my kitchen table and looked at the photograph of Emma that I'd shown at the gala, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude that I'd been able to help her, that my choices had made a real difference in her life and the lives of so many other children and families. I thought about my sister Emily, about the promise I'd made to her in that hospital room, about how that promise had transformed my life in ways I never could have imagined. The aftermath of that evening rippled out in ways I couldn't have predicted, creating changes not just in my own life, but in the lives of many people who had been at the gala. Victoria called me 3 days later and invited me to lunch, and when we met, she was wearing jeans and a simple blouse. Nothing designer, nothing ostentatious, and she seemed almost shy as she explained that she'd been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation. I went through my closet after the gala, she told me. Really went through it, and I was horrified by what I found. Dresses I'd never worn, some still with tags on them, shoes I'd bought on impulse and forgotten about, handbags that cost more than most people make in a month, all of it just sitting there representing money I'd spent trying to fill some void inside me that no amount of shopping could ever fill. She paused, clearly emotional. I calculated what I'd spent on clothes and accessories in the past year alone, and it was over $200,000. $200,000 on things I didn't need, didn't even really want, just bought because I thought I was supposed to, because it was expected, because everyone else was doing it. I listened without judgment, remembering my own moment of reckoning when I'd done a similar inventory of my life and choices. So I'm making some changes, Victoria continued. I'm donating most of my wardrobe to organizations that help women. I'm setting a strict budget for clothing going forward, and I'm redirecting the money I would have spent on my shopping addiction toward causes that matter, starting with a $100,000 donation to your foundation. I was stunned, not just by the amount, but by the genuine transformation I was witnessing in someone I'd written off as irredeemably shallow and selfish. Victoria, that's incredible, I said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. But I want you to make sure you're doing this for the right reasons, not because you feel guilty, or because you're trying to prove something to me or anyone else, but because it aligns with your own values and what you want your life to be about. She nodded thoughtfully. I've been asking myself that same question, she admitted, and I think the truth is that I've been performing a version of myself for so long that I'm not even sure who I really am underneath all the designer labels and social positioning. But I know I want to find out. I know I want to live more authentically, and I know I want to use my resources to make a real difference instead of just maintaining my image. We talked for hours that day, really talked in a way we never had before despite knowing each other for years, and I saw glimpses of a person I'd never suspected existed beneath Victoria's carefully constructed facade, someone thoughtful and sensitive and genuinely searching for meaning and purpose. She became one of the foundation's biggest supporters and advocates, using her social influence to encourage others to get involved, hosting fundraisers that were elegant but cost-effective, speaking openly about her own transformation and the emptiness of a life focused solely on material success and social status. Margaret Preston also reached out, confessing that she'd been struggling with shopping addiction for years, using consumption to cope with anxiety and depression, and a marriage that was falling apart, and she asked if I could help her find a therapist who understood the psychological aspects of overconsumption and materialism. I connected her with resources, and we met regularly for coffee, and I watched her gradually build a healthier relationship with money and possessions, addressing the underlying emotional issues that had driven her compulsive shopping. She eventually started her own initiative focused on financial literacy and mental health support for women, helping others recognize and break free from the cycle of using consumption to fill emotional voids. The ripple effects continued to spread, touching lives in ways both large and small, and I realized that my moment of humiliation at the gala had become a catalyst for change that extended far beyond anything I could have imagined. The foundation grew significantly, both in terms of funding and impact, and we were able to help hundreds more families facing medical crises. Emma, the little girl whose photograph I'd shared at the gala, completed her chemotherapy successfully and is now in remission, and her parents sent me a video of her butterfly-themed birthday party, where she danced and laughed with the energy and joy of a healthy child, and I cried watching it, overwhelmed with gratitude that we'd been able to help save her life. But beyond the tangible impact of the foundation's work, what struck me most was how many people told me that our conversation at the gala had prompted them to examine their own lives, their own values, their own relationship with money and possessions and success. And while not everyone made dramatic changes, many made small shifts that added up to more authentic, meaningful, purpose-driven lives. Looking back on that evening now, several months later, I can see it as a turning point not just for me but for many of the people who witnessed that confrontation between my values and their judgment. The moment when I pulled out those papers and revealed the truth about my choices, about where my money was going and why I'd chosen to live differently, that moment crystallized something important about the power of authenticity and the courage it takes to live according to your values, even when it makes you vulnerable to ridicule and judgment. I learned that standing firm in your truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people are mocking you, even when every instinct is screaming at you to conform or retreat, that kind of courage has the power to transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone who witnesses it. I learned that what looks like weakness, like wearing a cheap dress to a fancy gala, can actually be a profound statement of strength and conviction. I learned that the people who judge us most harshly are often the ones most trapped in their own fears and insecurities, performing a version of success that doesn't fulfill them, chasing approval that never satisfies, consuming in an endless attempt to fill a void that no amount of possessions can fill. And I learned that vulnerability, honest sharing of our struggles and choices and transformations, creates space for others to examine their own lives and potentially make different choices. The conversations I've had since that night have been some of the most meaningful of my life. Deep discussions about what really matters, about how we want to spend our limited time and resources on this earth, about what we want our legacy to be, and about the courage it takes to break free from societal expectations and live authentically. My sister Emily often says that her cancer was a terrible gift. Terrible in the suffering it caused, but a gift in how it clarified what mattered and gave her permission to live without pretense or performance. And I think my experience at the gala was something similar. A painful moment that cracked me open and forced me to stand fully in my truth, and in doing so inspired others to examine their own truths. I still attend social events occasionally, and I still dress simply and modestly. And while I sometimes notice looks or whispers, they don't affect me the way they once did, because I know who I am, I know what I value, I know the difference I'm making in the world. And that knowledge provides a foundation of confidence that no amount of external judgment can shake. I recently received a letter from Emma's mother, and she included a drawing that Emma had made for me, a picture of butterflies and rainbows, and a little girl with hair growing back. And at the bottom, Emma had written in her 7-year-old handwriting, "Thank you for saving my life. I love you." That letter is worth more to me than any designer gown could ever be. That drawing is more precious than any piece of jewelry. And the knowledge that my choices helped keep that beautiful child alive is more satisfying than any social approval or status symbol. Have you ever felt that deep sense of alignment when your actions match your values? When how you spend your money and time reflects what you truly believe matters? That's how I feel now, most days. And while it's not always easy, while there are still moments of doubt or temptation to slip back into old patterns, the overall sense of living with integrity and purpose makes all the challenges worthwhile. I want to encourage anyone watching this video who feels trapped in a cycle of consumption, comparison, and performance to know that there is another way. You can choose to live differently, to prioritize what really matters to you, to redirect your resources toward causes and people and experiences that align with your deepest values. It takes courage to break free from societal expectations, to risk judgment and mockery, to stand firm in choices that others might not understand. But that courage is worth it because it leads to a life of authenticity, meaning, and genuine fulfillment that no amount of material success can provide. I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged for choices you made that went against societal expectations? Have you ever had to stand firm in your values even when people were mocking or criticizing you? Or maybe you're currently struggling with the pressure to conform, to spend money you don't have on things you don't need, to perform a version of success that doesn't actually make you happy? Share your story in the comments below, because your experience might inspire someone else who's facing similar struggles. Your courage might give someone else permission to live more authentically. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you think differently about success, happiness, or what really matters in life, please leave a like on this video because it helps more people find these stories and hopefully find inspiration to live more authentic, meaningful lives. I also want to invite you to subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales because we share stories like this regularly, stories of people finding the courage to live authentically, to break free from societal expectations, to prioritize what really matters, and these stories have the power to change how we see ourselves and our choices. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story, because you never know which video might contain the message you need to hear, the inspiration that could transform your life, the reminder that you're not alone in your struggles or your desire to live differently. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community of people who value authenticity and meaning over appearance and status. And thank you for having the courage to question whether the life you're living is the life you actually want to be living. Because that question, that willingness to examine our choices honestly, is the first step toward creating a life of genuine purpose and fulfillment.